$200,000. That's how much Russia paid the Taliban for each American soldier that they killed. In today's video, we're diving into a new report that calls out the Russian officers by name who ran this program, how and why they financed these attacks, and maybe most importantly, why it's been known for years, but both the Trump and Biden administration essentially just sat on it. Now, all of this is coming from a new investigation just released by The Insider on January 8th, titled $200,000 for Every American Killed, how the GRU paid the Taliban for terrorist attacks. And of course, that article will be linked in the description below if you want to read it in its entirety. Now, starting out, I thought it was worth introducing you to a couple of the organizations and key figures throughout this story. Starting on the Russian side, we have the GRU, or Russian Military Intelligence Directorate. It's the intelligence branch of the Russian military, kind of like our DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, if you had to make a one-to-one comparison. We then have the head of the terrorist financing program, Lieutenant General Ivan Kosenyenko, who is also a deputy commander of the GRU Unit 29155. Which is a mouthful, but pretty rough organization start to finish. This is the organization responsible for conducting foreign assassinations on Russia's behalf. In fact, for more of a deep dive into this group, Chris Cappy, Task and Purpose, did a great video not too long ago. I'll link that in the description below as well. We then have the GRU's main liaison with the Taliban, Colonel Alexei Arkhipov, a.k.a. Alexei Titov, who's been referred to unofficially as one of Russia's special envoys to Afghanistan. Very bureaucratic, very plain language for the guy facilitating payments to the Taliban for the death of American warfighters. Turning over to the middleman, kind of the key player in all of this, we have a smuggler from Kunduz named Rahmatullah Azizi, as well as his extended family and network that stretched from Moscow in Russia to Helmand province in southwestern Afghanistan. And then, of course, we have the Taliban, the current leaders of Afghanistan. And during the time of this operation, from 2015 to 2019, the Taliban were an insurgent group targeting the United States, Afghan, and coalition partners all across the country. But before diving into why Russia set up this program, a quick thank you to the sponsor of today's video, Lumen. Well, it's January. You know what that means. People all around the world are making New Year's resolutions that most of them know full well they have no intention of actually seeing through to completion. But most people will at least try, I think, right? And that's got to count for something, right? I mean, most of the top resolutions we see year in and year out are about losing weight, exercising more, eating better, and just generally improving health. Love that. That's great. But some of us, myself included, could use a little help along the way. And that's where Lumen comes in, the sponsor of today's video. And this thing's actually really cool. So Lumen is a handheld metabolic coach, which sounds kind of really fancy. But really what it does is it measures your breath a couple times a day, which takes like 15, 20 seconds max. And then it determines if your body is currently burning carbs or fat. And look, I'm no medical professional, but burning fat, if you want to lose fat, does seem like it's probably a step in the right direction. And from that one breath, Lumen then gives you personalized guidance to improve your nutrition, workout, sleep, and even stress management. So my wife and I have both been using this for a while now, and it's been really cool to kind of see how my metabolism changes day to day. It feels like a really important data point to have. So if you want to take the next step to a fitter, healthier version of you, go to lumen.me/Preston or click the link below and get 20% off your Lumen. And now, back to the video. All right, so let's start at the beginning. According to the investigation, quote, Russia tried to interfere in the country, Afghanistan, immediately after the establishment of the Afghan interim administration in December 2001. The Kremlin initially sabotaged the U.S.-led intervention in the country through its networks in the local security services and the military established during the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. But those networks largely lost their usefulness after the U.S.-led reforms and establishment of the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces, ANDSF. Then, according to former officials, Iran offered to act as an intermediary with Taliban commanders to supply them with Russian weaponry and money. The GRU subsequently established direct contacts with the Taliban, first recruiting individual fighters, then supplying weapons and ammunition through Tajikistan, and finally, financing terrorist attacks. Now that's a lot of information, so let's break each one of these down individually, starting with the Iranian support of the Taliban and turning to a recent article in FDD, or Foundation for Defense of Democracies. They say Iran provided significant support for the Taliban, including safe havens, training, finances, intelligence, and weapons. The extent of this assistance was proven in U.S. federal court in October 2022 in Cabrera v. Iran. Don't see that a lot. with these, intermingling foreign relations between terrorist organizations and countries like Iran. This one, in fact, was proven in court. So it kind of gives you an idea of just how much of this was out in the open, public knowledge, and could be presented in a public setting like an American courtroom. FDD continues on saying, Iran supported the Taliban because it did not want the U.S. to maintain a presence on its eastern border, nor did it want an American-friendly government in power in Afghanistan. Not only did Iran provide a safe haven for Taliban leaders and fighters in Iran, but it also operated training facilities for Taliban recruits. Look, Iran, not good. We've known that for a long time. This isn't anything new, just trying to kind of set the stage here. And it shouldn't be a shock to anybody that Iran and Russia don't want the United States succeeding in a place like Afghanistan. Now, the second major allegation here was around Russia supplying weapons directly to the Taliban. And these allegations go back to at least 2017 when then General John Nicholson, the head of U.S. forces in Afghanistan, said in an interview that Russian weapons are being smuggled across the Tajik border. Quote, we've had weapons brought to this headquarters and given to us by Afghan leaders and said this was given by the Russians to the Taliban, end quote. He added that Russia had conducted a series of exercises on the Afghan border with Tajikistan. Quote, these are counterterrorism exercises, but we've seen the Russian pattern before. They bring in large amounts of equipment and then they leave some of it behind, end quote. So kind of the idea there, right, is Russia's showing up with a ton of equipment, be it small arms, night vision devices, light or medium machine guns, and they just happen to forget some of it as they exit the area, and then that's smuggled into Afghanistan to be used by the Taliban. Very Cold War-ish type action there, right? Supplying one's enemy with weapons. We've certainly done that quite a bit here in the United States, to include in Afghanistan during the Soviet war there in the 80s. So nothing out of the ordinary at all. But this little trickle of weapons wasn't really changing the status on the ground. I mean, U.S. and coalition forces at the time weren't any closer to withdrawing. So that's when Russia really upped the game and started offering bounties on the heads of American soldiers. Now, according to Douglas London, the CIA's counterterrorism officer in South and Southwest Asia from 2016 to 2018, quote, the Kremlin wanted the Taliban to spend more time killing Americans and less time killing Afghans. They offered financial rewards to encourage militants to take greater risks by attacking American targets in Afghanistan. And as cited by a source in the Afghan National Directorate of Security, or kind of their version of the CIA, if you will, they said the rewards averaged $200,000 for each killed U.S. or coalition soldier. Less was paid for Afghan soldiers. In total, Russia paid the Taliban at least $30 million in bounties. Again, that last part in the investigation coming from former workers in the Afghan NDS, or National Directorate of Security. Now, this time period from 2015 to 2019 included countless suicide bombings, VBIED, or vehicle-borne improvised explosive devices going off, big bombs, and complex attacks that left scores of U.S., Afghan, and coalition partners dead or wounded all across the country. But data during this window is actually still pretty hard to come by, and it's very difficult to really dial in exactly if the attacks against U.S. and coalition forces increased or really decreased during this window in time. The reason I say that is that we had fewer troops in country in 2018 than we did in 2012, for instance. And with that came fewer patrols, which meant fewer targets for the Taliban outside of the wire. So there's always been, even when we had a significant presence in the country, a real challenge in tracking the exact number of attacks and the target of those attacks day in and day out. So one thing worth keeping in mind here, but when they mentioned that the payments were designed to push the Taliban to take greater risks, that's where you start to see some of these complex attacks. Suicide bombings, breaching the gate of a compound like in Bagram, we saw that a couple times, as well as down in Helmand province during this window. Suicide bombers rushing in with small arms to try to inflict as many casualties as possible. Those are the greater risks that we likely saw during this period of time funded by the Russians. Now, looking at the process of how this whole thing worked, you remember Rahmatullah Azizi, that smuggler from Kunduz? Let's start there. So the insider reported that he and his family were recruited by GRU Unit 29155 back in 2015. That year, 2015, Azizi appeared in Russia, where he was given a passport and driver's license in the name of Rakim Akhmedov and the passport number in the GRU series. So what I mean by that is that his passport, issued under a fake new name, was issued right alongside some other known operatives of the GRU, specifically Unit 29155. For example, Azizi's passport number was only 2 digits different from Ruslan Bosharov, who's believed to be responsible for a series of assassinations organized by Unit 29155 to include the 2018 poisoning of Sergei and Yulia Skripal in England. So again, the GRU has this block of numbers supposedly, and they don't mix it up as much as they should. And surprise, surprise, this new GRU operative, Azizi, his passport shows very, very similar in the numbers to known GRU operatives. So from there, I think we can say that there's pretty direct ties from the GRU to Azizi, or at least as direct as you're going to get when you're talking about evidence from a secretive military spy organization. Anyways, back to the investigation. They say, quote, using his false identity in September 2017, Azizi registered a Russian company called R-Rigs Limited, which traded diamonds and other precious stones. Notably, according to former NDS officers, those are the Afghan intel guys, his father registered a similar company in Kabul around the same time. The NDS suggested that the trade in precious stones between Russia and Afghanistan was one of the methods used to funnel funds for the GRU's bounty program. According to the Trade Registry, R-Rigs ceased operations in 2020 and was liquidated in 2022. So to put together a brief little timeline here, the Doha Accords, a peace agreement between the United States and the Taliban, was signed in 2020, the same year that R-Rigs ceased operations. Then 2021 was the Afghan withdrawal, and a few months later, in 2022, R-Rigs was liquidated, which I'm sure just, coincidence. And then just to layer it on here, because we can, so why not, the company, R-Rigs, was actually registered at this address that I can't pronounce, but I'll put it on the screen if you want to give it a shot, which just happens to be a short walk from the GRU headquarters, also on a street where quite a few Russian spies are believed to have received their state-issued apartments. Again, I'm sure, top to bottom, just a coincidence. So now we've got pretty clear ties from the GRU through Azizi to this gemstone diamond trading front company. Now, between 2017 and 2019, Azizi flew from Russia to Afghanistan at least 13 times. Notably, he was present in Afghanistan during several key attacks that the NDS believes were paid for by the GRU. In fact, Afghan intelligence conducted a series of raids in 2019 in Kabul and northern Afghanistan, where they seized around $650,000 from the home of Rahmatullah Azizi, who had by that point fled to Russia, and worth noting, he still lives there today. So the process, in summary, kind of looks like this. The GRU set up a front company in Moscow the same time that a gem company was set up in Afghanistan by the asset's father. This opened up the door for illicit funds to enter Afghanistan and to be paid out to Taliban leadership by Azizi's network. Now, the missing piece here in terms of clear evidence that makes this entire thing undeniable is really the Taliban receipt of funds in exchange for services, I guess, is the way to put it, or in this case, targeting and killing American servicemen. So in prior investigations that the U.S. had done, they did state that they had intercepted electronic data showing large bank transfers to a Taliban-linked account from an account controlled by the Russian GRU. And they had previously acknowledged that Azizi is a known middleman between the GRU and the Taliban. Now, I'm not sure what that evidence would be, like a written agreement, a recorded conversation or something, but that hasn't been presented, or at least made public from what I can see, which means there is a gap here. A leap of faith has to be made to connect A to B. Personally, I feel like there's enough evidence lined up, but to each his own. But going back here a second, if an Afghan raid in 2019 led to the arrest of a bunch of the Azizi network and seized $650,000 in the GRU assets home, it kind of seems like this should have been a big story then, right? Not 5 years later. Well, it kind of was, but it was pretty quickly written off as like a conspiracy of sorts, or at least not provable. And that does raise a lot of questions today. Going back to the investigation, they say, quote, in 2020, a leaked U.S. intelligence report alleged that the Russian government had paid the Taliban to kill Western soldiers while peace talks were underway with the insurgents. The Taliban leadership denied the allegations, saying that the attacks on U.S. troops were spontaneous, self-funded, and predated a deal with the Trump administration to stop attacking Americans. The White House denied having specific knowledge of such a covert Russian program, end quote. And it gets deeper. Then presidential candidate Joe Biden accused the Trump administration of covering up evidence of Russian orchestrated attacks. But before anybody jumps out and decides to make this a partisan issue, in 2021, The Biden White House itself downplayed the reports, saying that they were based on low to medium level intelligence that relied only on, quote, financial transactions and statements from the detainee. So maybe conspiracy is too strong of a word, but it was discredited pretty quick. I mean, you had people in both administrations saying, maybe, but we can't prove it, so set that aside. And here's where it gets interesting. The insider's investigation not only uncovered evidence that corroborates the 2020 intelligence report, it also found that Afghan intelligence provided U.S. authorities with evidence of the program's existence and arrested several key accomplices of the bounty scheme. In fact, a U.S. intelligence official associated with some of this analysis at the time told the insider during the course of the investigation, quote, the Russian involvement in funding terrorist attacks was corroborated by multiple agencies based on multiple sources of information. So the evidence for this program was there. What was missing was names. The reluctance to definitively accuse Russia of bribing terrorists to kill American troops was not a lack of information. It was a lack of priority, maybe even courage. Now, for their part, both the Taliban and Russia denied the existence of this program. Taliban spokesperson Zabiullah Mujahid said, quote, our target killings and assassinations were ongoing in years before, and we did it with our own resources, without assistance from foreign intelligence agencies. And Russia also denied the bounty program and actually accused the New York Times, who ran a story about it, of spreading fake news, saying that that story led to threats against Russian diplomats. So that's a lot from a lot of different directions. To me personally, it checks out. It makes sense. It passes the common sense test, if you will. The Russians are always looking for any way possible to embarrass the United States and to lower our standing on the world stage. The withdrawal of Afghanistan is kind of right up their alley. And the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? I mean, the United States funded the Mujahideen in Afghanistan against the Soviets in the 1980s. It's really not out of the question that the Russians would do the same thing with the Taliban while we were there during the global war on terror. In fact, in recent weeks and months, we've seen the Russian government start to make initial moves to remove the terrorist designation from the Taliban. So the Taliban and the Russians are getting closer in more ways than one. But either way, I hope that this is the first deep investigation into this subject and we start to see a lot more come out before too awful long. I'll keep an eye out, but let me know what you think. Is this enough evidence to say that Russia put this bounty program together? Or are we still holding out for a handful of different pieces here? That's all I've got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.